Tonight we're going to talk about, I hope, a story that's not real boring, but it's about the real boring mill that existed in Cumberland County. This story has been alluded to many times in the past, and it's been told somewhat inaccurately in the past. So I'm going to try and cover those things as we go tonight, and correct some of those issues. Okay, there we go. So to give you a little context, and Ron, you got some red lines on the screen. I don't know how you did that, but the context of this story is really Cumberland County's role in the production of armaments for the American Revolution. And although it's an old story, there have been some recent advancements in our ability to tell the story. And two things in particular that you might be interested in. One is a book by Robert Smith, Dr. Robert Smith, who's a professor at the Northampton Area Community College, did a book entitled Manufacturing Independence. And that book goes into great detail describing how the revolutionary government of America developed the ability to produce arms and armaments for the American Revolution. And a good portion of his book is devoted to the public works at Carlisle or Washingtonburg. So there's some information in that book that is going to be important to tonight's story. And also in 2019, I did a compilation of the iron industry in Cumberland County. And one of the chapters I included was the public works at Carlisle or Washingtonburg. And in the process of that was able to conclusively locate the boring mill, which had not been done before. So we do have the advantage of some additional research that's happened recently. So what I want to talk about tonight are really 5 things. First of all, I'll talk about what is a boring mill. The second will be why was one located here? Third, and this is probably the most interesting to me, is where was it? What do we know about it? And then to conclude with how does our new knowledge impact older accounts? And hopefully it's an interesting story as we go through it. So the first thing we have to answer is what is in fact a boring mill? And a boring mill is simply a mill where the inner tube or the inner bore of a cannon was machined out or bored out. This process was also used in rifle making, and there are references to 1 or 2 boring mills in Pennsylvania in the 1700s and the 1800s. I suspect that they were rifle boring mills. I'm confident they were not cannon boring mills. So it's basically when you cast a cannon, you, after it's cast, have to machine the bore or the tube of the cannon so that the shell fits in properly. When you set a cannon off, there's an explosion at the back end of the cannon. The force of that explosion propels the cannonball out. If the cannonball or the shell that's in the cannon does not fit fairly tightly, the gases and the explosion will be dissipated. It doesn't have its effect. So the boring process is relatively significant. So in the left-hand side of your screen, you can see in that particular case, it's a brass or bronze cannon being bored out. On the right is an artist's rendition of what it would be like to bore out a cast iron cannon. And that's the process that we're talking about. There were 2 approaches to boring out a cannon. The traditional method, which is shown in this first set of slides, was a revolving tool. And as the tool revolved, the cannon tube, the barrel, as you can see here, was pushed against the tool. So you have the machine portion of the tool here going in, the shaft. In this particular case, you can see then that the carriage that the cannon is on is moved into the rotating tool. The problem with this, and this is the way it was done until about 1774, is that there's chatter in this bar that causes the boring tool itself to move and become a little bit sloppy. And it's just not as accurate a process. The other thing is that our machining tools um, were not that great, and any motion in that bar would amplify the inaccuracies. The other option was to turn the tube itself. And in this particular case, the cannon tube is here. That cannon tube would be rotating at a relatively low speed. And as the cannon rotated, the tube rotated, the boring tool would be driven into or advanced into the tube itself. So what we're talking about is this entire structure here, a tube would rotate, the tool would be advanced in to the cannon bore as the cannon was bored out. Now, this process was developed, this style of machining was developed in Britain about 1775. So it's not known if we had it available to us or if we used the older style. There were, prior to the war, some boring mills in Philadelphia that were used for industrial manufacturing, primarily for pump manufacturing, that allowed pump cylinders to be bored out with some accuracy, but it wasn't anything that we had here locally. Another thing that was done is that the end of the cannon tube was cut off, and it was also machined at the boring mill. So to give you an idea, here is the revolving shaft that's hooked up to a water wheel that would rotate the cannon tube, which would allow the boring tube to come in. This particular image shows an undershot water wheel, meaning that the water is running at the bottom of the wheel. This is probably what we had at Mount Holly, as we'll see when we go to talk about the mill itself. So what we were doing was using water power to turn the cannon or turn the boring tool to do the machining of the cannon tube. All we were doing, again, was taking the water energy, making it rotational energy to perform the machining process on the tube itself. And I'll talk about this more. We're not casting the cannons here, we're machining the cannons. This is an artist's rendition of what a boring mill might have looked like. And again, you can see that the water wheel in this case would be off to the left. The tube has been mounted and the tool is being advanced into the tube of the cannon as the boring process is being completed. So we're talking about the machining of the end of the cannon, the face itself, and also the boring would be done at the boring mill. Highly specialized, very important that it be accurate, and difficult to do. A few notes on American cannon manufacture. First of all, before the American Revolution, there were few, if any, cannon made in the United States. The cannon that we started to fight the Revolutionary War with were either stolen from or captured from the British government. I'm fairly safe to say that none had been cast here before the Revolution. It's very difficult to cast a successful cannon. And the failure rates when they tested them after production were 60% or more. They would produce a cannon tube, test it by loading it with a double charge, and if it didn't explode, that meant it had passed the test. Now, as I'll talk about, we're talking about castings here that are going to be in the range of 600 to several thousand pounds. They were poured at colonial iron furnaces that were relatively primitive without the benefit of metallurgical knowledge and very prone to failure. Again, the bore had to be accurate and the machining process was rather difficult. So when we talk about the boring mill at Pennsylvania or in Cumberland County and specifically in the Holly Gap, we have to relate where it came from. First of all, it was part of the public works at Carlisle. During the Revolution, there were two major armories that supplied the revolutionary government. One was in New England, the other was established at Carlisle. It was established in Carlisle in 1777 after the British captured Philadelphia. Prior to that, the armories work that was done, the small arms manufacture and repair, the production of ammunition, and the work on cannons, the boring and the finishing of cannons, was done at Philadelphia. But when Philadelphia was captured, we of course lost that. And they established the public works at Carlisle. It was originally to have been established in York. Politics apparently became involved, and contrary to General Washington's desire, it was moved to Carlisle. Part of that was the supposition that there were some leftover buildings from the French and Indian War when it was a British encampment here that might be used. And when they got to Carlisle, they found out that wasn't the case, that they were in very bad shape and had to be redone. But the Public Works was operated under the Commissary General of Military Stores, which was the supply arm of the Revolutionary Army under Benjamin Flowers and Samuel Hodgson. Both these names will come into our story a little bit later. They were staffed by artificers who have in many cases been mistakenly called artillerists, which they were not. These guys were trained machinists, support personnel, but they were members of the military. And they arrived here beginning in 1777, built the Public Works, and established some facilities there that I'll talk about in a minute. Initially, Washingtonburg, or the Public Works, was involved in small arms repair and manufacture. They got involved in the assembly of cannons. And when I say the assembly of cannons, what I'm referring to is that they produced the carriages, the wheels, the ammunition carts, and portable forges that went along with an artillery company. And they mounted the tube on those carriages. They did not cast the tubes here. And initially, they did not do any of the boring functions. The boring mill was part of the Public Works, but it was not completed until late in 1779. From what can be determined, there were no cannon cast by the Revolutionary government in 1777 and 1778. And if you think about that, 1777 is the year that we have the Battle of Brandywine, we have the Battle of Germantown. The British Army comes in and they take over Philadelphia, and the American government structure leaves, it goes to York. Everything is in turmoil. Most of the production that had been done is now threatened by the British. The cannon that were cast at Cornwall and Hopewell, from what can be determined. That work apparently stops during the occupation. 1778 is the last active large-scale combat in the Northern Theater, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in 1778. And after that, the war shifts to the south, and it becomes a small engagement, guerrilla-type warfare in the north, and we're able to return to some production of cannon. We've also, by that point, got some foreign intervention and some foreign money and can now afford to do things. So when we talk about the boring mill, it's not completed till late in 1779, toward the end of the Revolution. Now, just to give you an idea, this particular case, the cannon that's shown here is a 4-pound cannon. That means that it shoots a ball that is about 4 pounds, has about a 3.3-inch diameter to the bore, the opening in the tube. And what we're talking about being manufactured at the Public Works at Carlisle or Washingtonburg is the assembly that you see in the diagram. That's the carriage that cannon tube is going to be mounted onto. So by 1779, it's necessary for us to be able to bore out cannon tube and mount them onto these carriages. As you notice, the bulk of this assembly is made of wood. There are quite a number of either wrought iron or cast iron components, and those would have been produced at the Public Works, in many cases using bar iron that was cast at at furnaces in Pennsylvania. And it's possible that a small amount of that iron that became wrought iron was produced locally at Boiling Springs. That's not totally assured, but it is possible. But that iron came from various furnaces all over the area. And Washingtonburg itself consisted of a number of smaller blacksmith forges. If you've ever gone to Foundry Day or any arts and crafts ceremony, you'll in many cases see a blacksmith working, and he'll have a forge that might be 3 feet by 3 feet, and he's got charcoal burning in it or coal burning in it, and he pumps the bellows and that makes it get white hot. That is a forge. and that's a blacksmith forge. And what we're talking about at Washingtonburg, in many cases, you'll see accounts that there were forges or there was a forge at Washingtonburg. Well, a forge in this particular case is a small forge that a person would use to take a piece of bar iron and make it into a trigger assembly or make it into a lintel or a small part. Primarily, the bulk of the work at Washingtonburg was musket and rifle repair and manufacture. There was a brass foundry. They made belt buckles and shoe buckles. There might have been an iron foundry. And when I say iron foundry, what I'm referring to in that particular case is a remelt type operation where they would have taken iron from a furnace somewhere in the area and remelted it and possibly did some casting with it. There was a reverberatory furnace, and you'll see many accounts that say there was an iron furnace at Washingtonburg. Well, no, there wasn't per se. There was a reverberatory furnace, a picture of which is shown here, which indirectly heats iron and allows it to remelt on a small scale. You could do several hundred pounds in a large reverberatory furnace, but there's no furnace per se where they're doing conversion of iron ore and combining charcoal and limestone and making cast iron bars or pigs at Washingtonburg. That didn't exist. There was no use of water power at Washingtonburg that I can prove, and there was no large forge here. The forge, when we say, for example, the iron forge at Boiling Springs, that had a hammer that weighed maybe 700 pounds and was used to refine bar iron or pig iron into wrought iron. That didn't exist at Washingtonburg, and I can fairly definitely say that based upon Smith's research and also the absence of any long-term physical evidence. Had there been a furnace or a large forge there, it would have been used after the war, but we'll see that that was not the case. Now, in terms of a map of Washingtonburg or the public works at Carlisle, the most frequently published map is this one. This was made by Tussey when he did a book in 1939 on the Carlisle Barracks. And many people smarter than I have said of Tussey's work, he did a great job with the modern story of the barracks, but his revolutionary stuff is not that accurate. This is an imagined map that Tussey drew or had drawn based on what he knew, which was somewhat limited. And again, our ability to do research and our ability to access a lot of records is something that he didn't have. So I'm not criticizing him, but this map is fictional and it's totally incorrect. And I'll explain why in a minute. So I've even advised Carlisle Barracks, and they still use this on some of their information. This is wrong. It just is not correct. So what is correct? Well, as early as 1899 and in 1907, C.P. Humrick did a paper that unfortunately he never finished before his death, talked about Washingtonburg, and the locals at that time already did not have a clear understanding of where it was. Now, they're 100 years post-revolution, 120 years post-revolution. We're 250 years post-revolution. Where was it? Well, if we go back to some of the original land warrants and land records in the First Family series, and the people that did this have done us a tremendous service with their work. It's just an amazing resource. We can find that in this particular map, it identifies lots that were granted to James Wilson, but were now occupied or built on for the Continental stores, et cetera. So this is going back into the 1760s, into the 1770s, 1780s. So one thing that I want to point out, you want to kind of lock in your head a little bit is the shape of this survey line and also the presence of the creek. And this is the Letort Creek. You notice that it bends, and the shape of this line. The reason that I say that is this is a map of the 1828 Carlisle Barracks. By this time, it's being used by the Army, and that survey line matches up to what we saw previously. And we also see the Letort Creek. There's a couple other things to note here, several things to note. First is that there's an old mill dam. There was a grist mill in this area prior to the Revolution, probably operated by a McClure. It was relatively short-lived, and it doesn't leave much, if any, of a real estate record. The second thing is that this mill race is drawn was put in about this period of time in the 1820s, and it goes to Henderson, what's now known as Henderson's Mill, down on Route 11. So this did not exist during the Revolution. And it's important to note that there is not enough energy in the creek here at Carlisle Barracks or Public Works to have performed any significant work with it. It was fine for drinking, but it wasn't useful. The other thing on this map that's interesting, or other things, is that first of all, the lane that we see in the lower left is present day Garrison Lane. And the magazine that we see here is what we refer to today as the Hessian Guardhouse. So the Hessian Guardhouse in Garrison Lane, the Leetort Creek, the pattern of the survey will allow us to go back and place some of these buildings. Now, these buildings were rebuilt in the 1830s, and they were burned by the Confederates in the 1860s, in 1863, prior to Gettysburg. So the physical evidence was destroyed and was kind of lost. But to give you an idea, just to the recurrence, here's our survey line. And what's interesting is even at this point in time, and this is now in the 1860s, the government has not purchased the land that contains the Leetort Creek. It was low ground, it was swampy, it was not good. And it was also not a source of power. So it had very limited value, and it doesn't go into the what I would call now Carlisle Barracks or the War College till much later. But a couple interesting things to note here. The building in the lower left, number 7, is the Hessian Guardhouse. Garrison Lane goes off the lower left of the picture. And you notice the buildings, notice also the pathways and what they have marked. And this would have been probably in 1860, this might even be 1848 or 1860s map after the post was reconstructed. So if we take a look and we want to determine, well, where were those Revolutionary War era structures? Well, here's the Hessian Guardhouse. Here would have been the major buildings of the Public Works. Now, again, they were burned in 1863. They were rebuilt for the Indian School, and none of those buildings, well, limited amount of those buildings persist, but you'll see later pictures of the large girls building and the small girls and the large boys. Those buildings tended to follow the general locations. But it's also interesting to note 2 other things. If we go back to this diagram and we look at the roads and the paths in the 1860s, and we leap forward to a 2022 Google Map satellite view, look how much has remained the same. So it's relatively comfortable to say that we've located it. The other aspect of this is that you can start to see that the landforms and the land uses parallel some of those original survey lines, that there's been a lot of persistence. So again, I go back to the point, if there had been an iron furnace here, if there had been a forge here, there would have likely been some persistence on the mapping, in the local lore and knowledge, and probably would have been adapted for post-war use. There was nothing of that magnitude here. It was all small blacksmith forges. We don't have any pictures, but this is a clipping out of, I forget the name of the magazine, maybe Collier's, that shows the post after it was burned by the rebels. And you can see some of these buildings that have been destroyed. They would have been the Revolutionary era buildings that were rebuilt in the 1830s. So they weren't the same, but they were undoubtedly on the same footprint. Okay, so to get back to the boring mill, we needed a site with water power. We didn't have one. There was no water power at the Leetort. They had to go somewhere for water power. Availability and cost were factors. The government, by this time, by 1779, the revolutionary government is bankrupt. It has no money. You've heard the phrase, not worth a continental dollar. There were a lot of issues and a lot of difficulties. So when they did the boring mill, they were looking for water power. They also needed to go somewhere where they could kind of do it on the cheap. And this is, the story maybe gets a little complicated here. Let me see what I can do to describe this. First of all, on the left picture, we're looking at a survey in the Holly Gap, and to kind of help orient you, where my pointer is moving now is the area of what I would call Eaton Dykeman or Alston filtration. And their mill is in this area. This is the Holly Pike, or this is the Holly Gap. The creek turns there. Route 34 would follow roughly on the left-hand side. This is about an acre shown in this survey. So Route 34, the Holly Pike is here. And what's of interest is when this was surveyed, and this is not long after the Revolution, this land is owned by Colonel Benjamin Flower. Benjamin Flower is the director of the Commissary General, which is the supply component of the American Revolution. The government couldn't afford to buy this land. Flowers bought it with his own money, or Flower bought it with his own money. So this locates it as being north of Alstrom filtration or Eaton Dykeman along Route 34. This is another land survey. This land is now west of the creek. The Holly Pike would be over here, and I'll get a little more clear with this in a minute. This further locates it. This is Benjamin Flower's heirs listed on this particular survey, so that we've now located the south end and we've located the western edge of where the Flowers own land. There were two parcels of land that are kind of interesting. These are in the Holly Gap, and help orient you. The locals are familiar with the Snoopy tree in the Holly Gap, or where the toll gate used to be. There's a signboard here and a kind of belabored Christmas tree that helps show where we're at. So this is the parcel to the left here would be where Alstrom filtration is. Here's Route 34. These two parcels adjoin. Somewhere up in this area would be the carcass of the old deer lodge to help orient where you're at. Here is the creek. And this survey on the left is dated 1820. Gets a little bit confusing, but this locates the two parcels where Benjamin Flowers owned land or held title to land in the Holly Gap. So now we've narrowed it down to two parcels of land. Let's try and narrow it down a little bit more. The pictures that you see here were taken in 2016, and I was working on a project to develop a map of the trolley park in Mount Holly Springs, the Mount Holly Park, and was working with Bob Murray, the historian of Mount Holly. And Bob took me down to the creek, and he shows me these logs in the middle of the creek, and he says, I think these were something, but I don't know what they were. Of course, I'm a little whatever. I said, well, it looks like some logs in the creek to me, Bob. What do you think it was? He said, well, I don't know. Well, if you study the park, there was a bridge that crossed over from the railroad side, and the Route 34 side came over the creek and came over the park, and there was a bandstand built in it. So initially we thought, well, maybe it was that. But as we studied it, they don't match up to where that bridge was. And so as you look at kind of study these things, it's okay. It looks to me like it might have been part of a timber dam, but we're speculating. We don't know. We hadn't even started the conversation on the boring mill at this point, but had knowledge of these artifacts. Of course, it'd be nice to be able to carbon date them and go out, do ground penetrating radars we'll talk about in a minute. But these are some pretty interesting artifacts that are in the creek that would have been several feet underwater until the dam was removed, where the bridge goes over Route 34. So they're relatively recently exposed. Well, as we developed information on the boring mill, we go back out now in 2018 and we start to look, and if there was a boring mill, where would it be? Well, it's just coincidental perhaps, but it lines up with what was probably the raceway, or what might have been the raceway for the boring mill along Mountain Creek. And again, we're opposite the Snoopy tree, or opposite where the toll gate was, remembering that this particular area, especially the raceway up until to the level of this ground, would have been underwater until the dam was removed by the bridge on Route 34. So is it physical evidence of the boring mill? Possibly. Could it be other things? Possibly, yes, it could be other things, but there's some other evidence that we'll take a look at. First of all, we have documentation from 1845 that I consider reliable, and I'll touch on this in a minute, that the foundations of the boring mill were still visible in 1845. If we look, there was a dam. This is where 34 crosses, and to help orient you, this is again the carcass of the deer lodge is up here. This is where the dam was, where 34, the road to Baltimore, crosses the creek. Notice that that's a narrow point. This is a LiDAR image. It's a satellite image. Notice that I'm comparing here is the Snoopy tree and the location of the toll gate, and marking that at the same place. Notice that the creek is narrower here. This is also the area where we saw that raceway. And those wood artifacts appear in this general area. So it seems to me plausible. It's not 100% proof. We don't have any eyewitness accounts. There's no pictures, obviously, but it seems plausible to me that based on the evidence that we have, we know the boring mill was in the South Mountain. We know it was along Mountain Creek. We know, as I'll talk about just in a second, that it was on the western side of the creek, and we can locate it as being near the toll gate, all of which brings it down into this area along Mountain Creek. So what do we know about it? Well, it was built on land originally owned by Thomas Gordon. We can track that down through some land records. It's possible, and this gets a little nebulous, and I'll be perfectly honest. There was a Thomas Gordon that lived in South Middleton Township, but did not own land. And he appears on the tax list in Middleton Township. It wasn't South Middleton until 1810. He appears on the tax list in Middleton Township in the 1870s, or I'm sorry, the 1770s and 1780s. He owns 2 horses and 2 cows, but he owns no land. So he's a tenant in somebody's farm. So there's a local Thomas Gordon. He later goes into the Army and serves during the war. However, there was a Thomas Gordon in Philadelphia who was a landowner and may have been the person who was granted the patent or the warrant for the land in 1763. There is a Thomas Gordon during the American Revolution whose land is taken by the revolutionary government. He was found to be a loyalist. In fact, he was a young man, less than 18, and the son of probably the other Thomas Gordon. His mother put him in the British Navy, and as a result of that, the revolutionary government took his property, which he was probably heir to this. He later recants and gets his land back, or gets his favored status back in the 1780s, but he never gets his land back from what we can tell. So we know that land was warranted to Gordon in 1763. It was surveyed, the one piece that I looked at in 1780, but that's about all that we know about it. We do know that the boring mill site was owned by Benjamin Flowers, as I talked about. He's in the Commissary General Department. And in 1782, Flowers shows up on the tax list at the Gap as owning a sawmill. Now, there was a sawmill operating in conjunction with the boring mill, but there's no direct evidence on the tax list to connect the boring mill to Colonel Flower. However, on the tax list, there is a listing for Colonel John Davis. Now, with some qualifications, Davis is listed on the tax records in Middleton Township from 1780 to 1783. He owns a farm, probably north of Carlisle, but he's also taxed for 34 acres from 1780 to 1783. It's described on one of the tax assessor's list as a proprietary tract, which would tend to me to say that it's the site that was seized. And it also identifies it as west of Mountain Creek. So it's separate from his farm north of Carlisle. He is involved in and is a deputy quartermaster at this point in the war. And there is a known association between Colonel John Davis, Flower, and the Public Works. He was directed to assist the Public Works, and he did so. He had served earlier in the 3rd Cumberland County Militia. He dies in 1784. Flowers dies in 1783. and the records in there. But the circumstantial case, and it is kind of circumstantial, but it's, I think, fairly accurate, is that the boring mill we know was in the South Mountain. We know it was located along Mountain Creek, and we know that from records that exist of payments that were made to people for work done at the boring mill. In some cases, they hauled things to and from, and there are slips that identified as the boring mill in the South Mountain or the boring mill along Mountain Creek. They also purchased tallow, which would have been the grease that was used to lubricate the functions at the boring mills. So we can narrow it down from that standpoint. So I feel fairly comfortable that we've narrowed it down. The only way to do it would be to do some archaeological work. There is a large book that has not been scanned and nobody can access at Carlisle Barracks that has more records, but until the government finds the wherewithal to digitize that, we're kind of stuck in terms of any further records that I could find at going further. Now, the final piece of information comes into focus here pretty quickly is that when Flowers died, they had to, or Colonel Flower died, they had to settle his estate. And there's a record of that, which I'll show in a minute. And I also said that there's a credible witness, an individual by the name of Kropf, who was an engineer who came in and did evaluation of the iron furnace estate at Mount Holly Springs, which was not started till after the Revolution. And it was bankrupt in 1845. He comes in, he does a very extensive study of the ironworks, and he writes of the boring mill that was located at the Holly Gap, and he's the person that identifies the foundation that's visible across from the toll house. He was knowledgeable and he did research, and I think that his information on the boring mill is credible. His other information seems to be pretty good. So that, I think, again, narrows it down. Here's to me, kind of the clincher. This is a newspaper advertisement from 1783 that offers the boring mill for sale. It says it's 6 miles from Carlisle, from the great road leading to Baltimore, which would be Route 34. He talks about an excellent stream, and it says that there's a dwelling house, a stable, sawmill. And if you're trying to read this, you have to realize that at this point in time, they used F instead of S when they printed. So it's the stream, et cetera, et cetera. Although the F is still an F when it's an F, kind of interesting. But you can see frost is kind of interesting to read. But there is a stable, a sawmill, and a large, elegant stone building erected by the public for a boring and grinding mill. So we're along Mountain Creek, 6 miles from Carlisle, with the boring and grinding mill. And another thing that's significant, I should have highlighted it, but it says being within 4 or 5 miles of 2 furnaces. There is no furnace in Mount Holly or in the Holly Gap at this point in time. That's been incorrectly stated in the past, and this is just another kind of verification of it. So we had this stone mill. It's going by 1845. Where did the stone go? Well, I suspect the locals took it to build Kidderminster, the paper mill, or it might have gone when they built the furnace at Upper Holly. It might have been sold, who knows, but the building's going by 1845, which is not that long after the Revolution. So again, we have this image. If you can picture it, this would have been located along the creek. I said earlier it was an undershot water wheel. That water wheel powered the ability to turn the tube, which got bored out. So that's kind of the boring mill story, what a boring mill was, why it was here, where it was here, what it did, what we know about it. And then we can go what happened after the story. So after the American Revolution, things start to happen locally. On the 1785 and 1786 tax assessors list, George Stevenson Jr. appears on the tax list as owning a boring mill. Stevenson's story is kind of interesting, and this is Junior. A lot of people get Senior's story mixed up here. The boring mill disappears after this time. Kidderminster, which becomes what's now the lower mill from Mount Holly, was established in 1828. And the accounts of that say that the Phoenix Tool Works, which they made edge tools, was a short distance upstream. I don't know what a short distance is, whether a quarter mile, eighth of a mile. What I suspect was when they put the dam in for the lower mill, which is kind of interesting the way that they do that. That whole story is interesting, and that's another program in the fall. They would have been able to leave the dam in where the boring mill was and may have used what was left of it for this Phoenix Tool Works. Now, the Phoenix Tool Works is mentioned briefly in one account, and then it disappears. In 1782, Stephen Folk establishes a bloomery forge, which is a primitive method of converting iron ore into blooms or pig iron that can be processed. He doesn't build a furnace for a couple of years after that, but he also had a sawmill. So we start to put names that we know in places that we know and that we can trace forward. I'm not going to do that tonight, but that again kind of further narrow us down as to where the boring mill was located and where it got to help in that way. So how does what we know now affect what's been said over the years? Well, there's myths that relate to the boring mill and the whole story. And they relate to Boiling Springs, Pine Grove, to Mount Holly Springs, to Wrought Iron Cannon, and Colonel Denning. And I'll touch on those briefly to conclude here or to wrap things up. First of all, it's been misstated, but there were no cannon tubes cast at either Boiling Springs or Pine Grove during the American Revolution. There were in the later years, and I'll expand on this in a minute, some shells or bullets, armaments produced there that were cast, and they were taken to the public works and processed into the finished goods. But that's later in the war. That's fairly well documented. There might have been some iron came from Boiling Springs after 1779 for use at the public works. There might have been some casted or iron from Pine Grove that went to the public works, but we didn't make any cannon there. The Boiling Springs myth, as many of the myths of Boiling Springs are, was propagated by a gentleman by the name of Jared Bucher. Bucher bought the furnace in the 1890s. He married into the Mullen money and brought his bride to Boiling Springs, and then he started to make up these fantastic tales that we now believe is local history. And in 1934, in conjunction with the myth about Baron Stigl being buried at Boiling Springs, which was created by a genealogical researcher in 1929, Jared Bucher advances this ludicrous claim that he found 150 cannons stored in a dungeon at the furnace that nobody but this ex-slave knew about, that told him about this. And he further relates that the cannon cast at Boiling Springs were captured at Brandywine and taken to the Tower of London. Not true. On several levels. So anyway, that's part of the myth. And part of the myth is that, and let me get that in a minute, I'll kind of jog out here, but there was one small ceremonial cannon cast at Boiling Springs in 1788 by Michael Egge. Now, Michael Egge wasn't here for the American Revolution at the beginning, and I'll explain why in just a second. But Egge cast a small ceremonial cannon in 1788, and you ask why? Well, he was a Federalist, and there was going to be a 4th of July celebration in 1788, and he cast this little cannon, and he takes it in, and they shoot it off. They have like 10 or 12 toasts, and each time they have a toast, they blast the cannon off, and it makes a neat newspaper story, and they march it out to the public works, and they put it away. We don't know what happened to it. However, this might be coincidental. In 1821, there's another ceremony in Carlisle, and they drink a bunch of toast, and they shoot the cannon off. This time the cannon blows up and it kills a couple people. That's in 1821. The newspaper account's kind of vague. It says it's a small cannon and it was donated about 30 years ago. So I can't verify this, but it's possible in my mind that that small cannon was the one that Egge donated in 1788, and it's no longer in existence. So in any event, Boiling Springs furnace was owned by Quakers. The Quakers would not allow their furnace to produce armaments. By 1779, according to the tax assessor's list, General Armstrong of Carlisle has taken over the furnace at Boiling Springs. Again, our revolutionary government was pretty forward. If you weren't loyal and you weren't helping, we took your property. So we came out, we seized the Carlisle Iron Works at Boiling Springs, brought in a guy by the name of Thomas Mayberry, who had operated furnaces in New Jersey, had worked with Colonel Flower, and had connections with the Commissary General's office. And he lost a lot of money. That's another story. But Mayberry is listed as owning it in the 1780s. And by 1781, Michael Egge's here. This is when he starts to get his ownership. Now, Michael Egge does buy the interests of the Quakers after the war, and he's legit in terms of that. But it's very clear that no cannon were ever cast at Boiling Springs, and that the boring mill was on the South Mountain. But there's a book called Beyond Philadelphia, which is an academically credited book. And in the section in Cumberland County, they make two claims. One is the Boiling Springs furnace made cannon castings. They did not. A boring mill at the works, meaning at the public works in Carlisle, used Letort spring power and manufactured cannon up to 3,000 pounds. The boring mill was in the South Mountain. There was no boring at the Carlisle, what became Carlisle Barracks, or the Carlisle Public Works. They did assemble the cannon and they put them on carriages. So just to relate some of what we hear. Now it gets better. Local history book of Mount Holly Springs. And again, we have the advantage of a lot more time, a lot more research, things that these people didn't have available. And they recorded what they knew, the stories that were told. And in many cases, the stories have some foundation, but they don't necessarily fall into order correctly. So when you look at the local lore of Mount Holly, it says that the first forge was in Mount Holly in 1748. Not true. Had there been a forge there, it would have probably used the same power that the boring mill did. There was no forge in Mount Holly till after the Revolution. And it also says that the iron forge at Mount Holly turned out the first cannon in Pennsylvania. Again, we know that not to be correct. And local legend had that the English built a boring mill in a little house to hide it in the gap at Mount Holly before the American Revolution. So if you put the story together, there was a boring mill in the gap during the Revolution, and it was across from a little house, which was the toll gate. And that's, again, how stories get twisted. And Dr. Eggle gets involved in this in the 1890s, and they authoritatively say that that's not the case, but we'll see Dr. Eggle's myth. Now, another myth that comes out of this whole story is that of wrought iron cannon. The cannon that we've talked about have all been cast. A wrought iron cannon, and I'll show an image of it in just a second, is one where pieces of iron are welded together, which means we have to make them red hot and be able to weld them together to make a cannon. Wrought iron cannon were first manufactured in the 1400s, and they used stone shells. And the reason that they did that, if you used a cast iron cannonball and a wrought iron cannon, you'd only get fired a couple of times because the cannonball is harder than the cannon, and it would eat your cannon away pretty quickly. These wrought iron cannon that they did attempt to make and used with limited success had a lot of limitations, one of which was that they blew up, and it didn't take long for guys learn to not set them off. A US military study in the 1840s says that the most often repeated and universally unsuccessful attempt to make wrought iron, or the most frequently repeated, most unsuccessful experimental efforts were those that attempted to make wrought iron cannon. So there's a whole body of knowledge on this, but a legend has arisen that wrought iron cannon were manufactured. Some people say at Mount Holly, other people say at Carlisle, other people say at Middlesex. But a cast iron cannon, I have a sample here, are individual segments of iron that are welded together. And when I say weld, the only way you could weld it this time was to make the two pieces of iron red to white hot, smash them together and pound them together and cause them to fuse together. The problem with doing that with wrought iron is this iron was of generally such poor quality that if you heated it that much, you destroyed it in the process because of the impurities that were embedded in it. But if you were able to weld the pieces, you then put rings around the cannon so that it wouldn't explode when you detonated it. Again, the problem being that if you used a cast iron ball in this, it had a tendency to eat the cannon every time you shot the cannon off. Now, it is acknowledged that an individual in Philadelphia may have successfully made a 3-pound cannon prior to the American Revolution, or at the time of the American Revolution. It was used at Brandywine, according to tradition, with some support, and it was captured and it was taken to the Tower of London. And that tradition all comes back, or much of it comes back, the Tower of London, to the story that Jared Bucher told. American technology was not able to adopt wrought iron to cannon manufacture until the 1860s. This is a tube of a Parrott gun. The barrel itself is cast, or the tube is cast. It's reinforced near the breech with wrought iron that's put around it. But by then we're able, this is a century later, we're able to make much better iron, and we have much better capability, industrial capability, to handle it and apply it to the gun. And that's just a breech reinforcement. Again, wrought iron cannon. None survive. There's nothing in the literature of any that survived. There are some statements in the records of the public works that said wrought iron cannon were shipped. And there's pretty agreed legend that 1 or 2 were attempted, and that they set in waste on the floor at the public works and were never finished. And the government said, the government knew at that time that there were attempts to make wrought iron cannon. And finally, late in the war, they said, forget it. Don't waste our money. We have other stuff. So until somebody can conclusively prove that they were made, they were used, and a replica or an artifact shows up, the argument to me is stronger against wrought iron cannons being made than wrought iron cannons being made. And the reason I'm harping on this is that the legend, when we get into Colonel William Denning, says that he made wrought iron cannon, and he did it. It was so hot that it melted his buttons. And the first time they tell the story, they say that it melted his pewter buttons, and then they realized that melting point wasn't real good, so they changed it to lead buttons because they melt at a higher temperature or lower. I forget, I'd have to look it up. But the story changes. The legend of Denning says that everybody else would go to lunch, and while they were out at lunch, he would make a wrought iron cannon. And when they came back, like half hour later, there was the cannon. He wouldn't let anybody see how it was done, and et cetera, et cetera. But if there were any wrought iron cannon made, they were probably small swivel guns, and very small diameter. The legend says they were made at Carlisle, Middlesex, or Mount Holly. So they weren't made at the boring mill. There was no way to heat anything there. They weren't made at Carlisle, other than 2 attempts that we know of. And like I said, it's possible one was made, but in any event, that brings us to the legend of William Denning. And William Denning's story is pretty interesting. It is very likely that Denning was an artificer at the public works. I would say 100% probable. It's very possible, he was from New Jersey, that he knew the person in Philadelphia that successfully made a wrought iron cannon, if that in fact happened. It's very hard to say where he lived, but we know that he died northwest of Newville. And at the time of his death is the first time that the story appears that he had made a wrought iron cannon. And that story gets enhanced with time. And I just say it gets enhanced with time. It's hilarious. But the state, remember Dr. William Eggle, the authority that was involved in the legend at Mount Holly, gets involved in the Denning story. He determines it to be true. And the state in the 1890s, based on the work of a couple local people, and probably maybe building on some factual information, but the pieces are not related and mixed up, but they come together into a story. The state allocates thousands of dollars and erects the monument that you see here in the center image to Colonel Denning in the Presbyterian churchyard or graveyard in Newville. It's pointed east, symbolically toward the British, and it kind of has some attributes of a cast iron cannon. It's not over Denning's grave because we don't know where Denning is buried. And we call him Colonel Denning. He was a sergeant. But anyway, the legend goes on with time to say that Denning's cannon was the one that Molly Pitcher used at the Battle of Mammoth. Now, there's some other issues with Denning's story and the wrought iron cannon, and that is that there's a pretty good probability that he was in combat in 77 and 78, which is when Molly allegedly used his cannon, and he doesn't come to the barracks till after that. But anyway, I don't want to get into the whole Molly thing because there's a modicum of truth maybe to the Molly picture thing if you dig into it a little bit more. But when they dedicated Molly's monument, they said that they used an image of Colonel Denning's cannon, which is a good old 4-pounder here. So, that becomes to me kind of the biggest myth that comes out of the whole public works thing is Denning's attempts to build these wrought iron cannon that are said to have happened at Mount Holly, which he may have worked there at the boring mill, but there was no wrought iron cannon manufacturer there. So anyway, in summary, and I hope this wasn't too boring, but we talked about what a boring mill is. It's a machine shop where they bore out the tube of cannon to the appropriate caliber or diameter. It was located in the Holly Gap. We know that. We know, I think conclusively, it was located to the west of the creek, opposite the toll gate. It operated from 1779, maybe 1780, probably no later in 1781, because by that point the war was over. We're fairly definite on the location, not absolute. That would take some proof, ground penetrating radar, maybe some archaeology, maybe there's other records that we could turn up. We do know that many myths have arisen over the story of Revolutionary War cannon locally, that knowledge of Washingtonburg, which comes from Dr. Smith's book, and the other information that we have in the boring mill kind of corrects some of those myths. And hopefully that tells the story to everybody's satisfaction. So the boring mill, if you go back the road to the parking area for the Holly Preserve, about halfway back on the left-hand side between the road and the creek, in fact, you're probably driving over it, would be the area where the boring mill was. So that's the story of the boring mill, the real boring mill, and I hope the not real boring story of the real boring